Welcome back. In this segment, we're going to take a look at some major legal stories in the news, starting with the latest developments in the growing child sex and prostitution investigation into Florida Congressman Matt Gaetz. A plea deal announced in federal court in Orlando could prove problematic for embattled Florida Republican Congressman Matt Gaetz. Joel Greenburg, a one-time close friend of Gaetz and former Florida county tax collector, pleading guilty to 6 of 33 federal crimes he was facing, including sex trafficking of a minor. In court filings, Greenburg admits he paid a 17-year-old girl for sex and claims to have introduced her to other adult men who engaged in commercial sex acts. And as part of his plea deal, Greenburg must fully cooperate with federal investigators. His lawyer hinted that could be bad news for Gaetz.
Does my client have information that could hurt an elected official? I guess this is just, must-see television. You'll just have to wait and see.
No individuals, including Gaetz, were named in court or in the plea deal, and Gaetz has repeatedly denied any wrongdoing. Sources tell ABC News the Justice Department has spent months looking into whether Greenburg and Gaetz paid women cash and other items for sex and travel. Gaetz has stood firm in his denial of any misconduct and rejecting calls to step down. He's also making jokes about the allegations.
I'm a canceled man in some corners of the internet. I might be a wanted man by the deep state.
Greenburg also pleaded guilty to federal charges of stalking, identity theft, wire fraud, and has admitted to falsely painting a political rival as a pedophile. That former political opponent says the state of Florida failed to monitor Greenburg's behavior.
Under a functional and effective system of checks and balances, it is quite possible some crimes might have been prevented.
Another BFF of Donald Trump's, Rudy Giuliani, also facing legal troubles of his own surrounding his dealings with Ukraine as he acted as the former president's personal attorney. Federal investigators raided Giuliani's home and office last month, seizing his electronic devices. Now Rudy's attorneys are trying to block prosecutors from using what they seized, saying it was obtained during an illegal search. For more on both cases, we turn once again to former federal prosecutor Roland Riopelle. Roland, let's start with that most Florida of Florida stories. Congressman Matt Gaetz, his alleged sexual escapades, and yesterday's guilty plea of his former playmate, Joel Greenburg. We know the disturbing details. Did you learn anything more about Gaetz and the case against him from yesterday's guilty plea from Greenburg?
Well, yes. I went ahead and reviewed the paperwork, Andrew, and it's stunning. Mr. Greenburg was apparently just a one-man crime wave, and the degree of detail and description in the papers that were filed by the government is truly unprecedented in my nearly 40 years as a lawyer. And I think that was done to sort of have an in terrorem effect on Mr. Gaetz and anyone else Mr. Greenburg might have associated with, because there's constant mention in there of others who committed crimes with Mr. Greenburg, and those others must, all of them, be very worried today.
It sounds like you don't think Matt Gaetz's prospects are that good. Greenburg, though, is going to be sort of like the Michael Cohen of witnesses. He's probably got legitimate dirt to dish, but how do you believe anything that comes out of his mouth? They may also have the testimony of some of the women, but they kind of have the same credibility problem. How do you get around that?
Well, it's very clear, Andrew, that the prosecution has done a great deal to corroborate what Mr. Greenburg and any other witnesses may be telling them. There's mention of Venmo accounts and bank transactions and all kinds of things like that. So I think by the time the government brings a case, they will have all kinds of corroboration for the admittedly dubious testimony that they'll be sponsoring. And that kind of corroboration will typically be very persuasive to a jury. So I think by the time the horses run, Mr. Gaetz is going to have a tough time winning the race. That's my impression.
Gaetz insists that he's innocent, says repeatedly he will not resign his seat in Congress. We've seen plenty of other cases where members use their office and the possibility of resignation as leverage to get a better deal. Is there a deal to be made with Gaetz, or do you think DOJ throws the book at him?
I doubt there is a deal that's very palatable to Mr. Gaetz. The child sex crime alone here is about a 10-year mandatory minimum. And they might plead down from that, but it would be very rare for someone violating these statutes to get a probationary type disposition. And given Mr. Gaetz's prominence, I just don't think that's going to happen. I think the best he can do is a number of years in jail. And if he wants to do that, the DOJ might cut a deal with him. But my guess is this thing will be fought to the end, because Mr. Gaetz impresses me as that type of person. He certainly hasn't clammed up and gone to ground so far, and I don't expect he's going to seek a resolution here.
Want to switch gears, Roland, to this raft of voter restriction laws that we've seen passed in red state after red state. In the past, in the not too distant past, disaffected parties could seek relief in federal court, but boy, our federal courts have changed a lot, even in just the last few years. Can the courts help push back on voter restriction laws? How much of a long shot do you think that would be right now?
They can to a degree, but you're absolutely right, Andrew, with the Shelby County decision out of the Supreme Court just a few years ago, which essentially gutted some of the strongest provisions of the Voting Rights Act of 1964. There is less that can be done in court than previously, but the Department of Justice is clearly staffed by terrific lawyers with a long history of dealing with these issues, and there remain claims that can be brought, and I expect that there will be a very vigorous attempt to push back against some of these laws in federal court based on principles, more general constitutional principles like equal protection of the law. There are old precedents that stand for the proposition that there should be one man for one vote. And that can be used to press back to some degree on gerrymandering. And I think the DOJ will be very active in going after some of these things. So I think we can look to that.
As you know, there's an effort in Congress to restore the Voting Rights Act. There's another effort to expand it even further, H.R. 1. If either one of those gets passed, can that be applied to the current political situation, to the current voting restriction laws that have been passed across red states?
Yes, it can, because there isn't the equivalent of the ex post facto clause for civil litigation. For criminal law, it is unconstitutional to pass a statute to punish conduct that has already happened. You can only pass criminal statutes to punish conduct in the future. But that is strictly limited to criminal law. And indeed, if Congress passes H.R. 1, the Department of Justice will have a great many more arrows in its quiver to use to go after these very restrictive laws.
Finally, Roland, I want to ask you about another former federal prosecutor by the name of Rudy Giuliani. He wants the evidence that was taken in the raid of his apartment thrown out. I wonder if you think that he'll get that request honored, and will the Justice Department offer Giuliani a deal if he flips on the only guy they would want him to flip on, Donald Trump? Would you make that offer?
Well, I'd have to hear what Rudy has. My guess is he has some pretty good stuff on Donald. He's certainly hinted at that. And if Rudy had the goods, and could do the king effectively, you'd have to hear it out. Rudy, like Mr. Greenburg, I suspect, has a long list of problems that will damage his credibility, but you'd have to listen to him. Will he be able to stop the Department of Justice from looking at the evidence that they seized at this point? No, there's no way he can really challenge the searches that have gone on to date. If Rudy is indicted someday, he'll be able to move to suppress the evidence that the government obtained by the searches. And if he's successful there, which I doubt he would be, but if he was, that may damage the government's ability to bring its case against him. But for now, there is nothing he can do to stop the government from looking at this evidence. The most he can do at this point is to make a motion under Rule 41 of the Rules of Criminal Procedure for the return to him of his property, namely the contents of his phone and the iCloud. But if the government does return his property, the rule explicitly provides that the court should provide for a way for the property to be available to the government in the future if it is needed. So it's not as though he can get this evidence away from the government and prevent it from looking at it at this point. That's just not going to happen.
Roland Riopelle, former federal prosecutor, the good kind, staying on the good side of the law. Roland, as always, great to see you. Thank you.
You know, where there's profit, I'll go, Andrew. So I'm not always on the good side. But it's good to be with you, and I hope to see you soon.
And up next, we're going to go inside the Beltway, where Kevin McCarthy is doing what he can to try and stonewall a commission to investigate the Capitol riot. We'll talk to ABC News political director Rick Klein about that and more after a break.